don't assume that your idea is not worth writing. You came up with the idea, so it's worth writing. Even if you don't end up publishing it, even if along the way it turns out that it's not the idea for you right now, it's worth working on it right now. Don't be afraid to ask for help. If you have the faintest idea of what you want to do and you know you want to do something with it, hop on a brainstorm prickle, talk it out with IGs, talk it out with friends, with people who don't write at all. Just share your initial idea and see what comes of it when you start talking about it. And finally, don't force yourself to follow a system. What Anya just said about feeling like you should do all kinds of things, that can start really early on in the process. When you have people you follow on Instagram, for example, who follow a specific process when they write a book from idea to initial draft, it can be really tempting to feel like you need to do that as well because they're successful. So that's going to work, right? But the different methods don't work for every single writer. So you need to figure out what works for you and definitely try out different systems. But don't feel like you need to follow a specific system, and don't feel like you need to stick with one system either. Try out a system. If it doesn't work, move on to the next. Just trial and error. Then the initial draft. Please do use brackets and skip parts whenever you don't feel like writing. This is something that comes up again and again and again in the Hedgie house. You have permission to use brackets, you have permission to skip parts, you have permission to write everything in the wrong order. Just write whatever you feel like writing and make sure that you get the story on paper, whichever way works for you. For me, I was trying to get a first draft down. I was already using brackets, but that wasn't enough. So I decided to just create a super detailed outline. And once I decided that, I finished my draft 0 in a week, I think. So it took accepting that idea of it's okay to let go, it's okay to not write a full manuscript, to get that story down on paper. And now it's at the point where when I pick it up again, I can start self-editing. And it's going to vary from book to book, from story to story, from person to person, from genre to genre, what works in that regard. But just go with your gut again. Most of the time, we know what will work for us, but we're afraid to try it out because the rest of the world maybe doesn't work that way. So try it out, see what happens, and then share if it does work for you so that other people who also want to try that type of approach will be feel validated in their thoughts and can also try it out. So
before you keep going, I just want to say thank you so much for saying that, because I do think that especially in the beginning, or even in this, whenever we get into a point where we're just like, I feel stuck, I don't know what to do, and you see other writers who you are labeling successful in your eyes, right? Which is hilarious because all of us feel unsuccessful in some regard, but you might see somebody as successful and they're doing it this way, and you would feel the pressure to do it their way because their way worked, but their way worked for them. And so something that is so important, thank you so much, Elza, for saying it, is that when we have different writers share their ideas in a daily coaching video or in a prickle, that is not Quill and Cup saying you must do it this way. This is Quill and Cup saying, like, here's another way. Like, here is a route that you may not have known existed. And this is just something that you can add now to your vocabulary. It is not an obligation for you. It is an opportunity for you to either say, yes, I'll try that. And it might trial and error. We put such high stakes to it, but it's all a game. We're all just playing.
Yeah.
Fun. This is fun. Okay.
This is fun.
This is fun. Maybe if we say it like 10 times, we'll feel it. She says as she like laughs with tears in her eyes. This is fun. But no, thank you so much, Elza, for saying that. I didn't want to cut you off, but it felt like...
No, but thank you for reaffirming that. Yeah, and I like what you said about the vocabulary. I experienced that a few years ago. I was listening to a podcast. I think it was Elizabeth Gilbert, maybe another writer who was on a podcast with Gretchen Rubin, I think. And she mentioned binge writing. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's that's me. I like binge writing. I don't write every day. I prepare myself for a stint of insane writing. Then I get a ton of work done. And then after that, I don't write for the longest time. And that's okay. But when you look at social media, you feel like it's not okay because everybody is like, write every day, write every day. So it's when you get to put a word on it, it makes it so much easier to accept it as a possibility. So don't be afraid to make up your own words either. I mean, if you have a way that works for you and you're like, this works for me, but it feels like it doesn't exist, well, put it into existence. You got the power. All right, so that initial draft, something that I found really helpful is to consider the initial draft as a placeholder. So instead of feeling like it's the beginning and you need to build on that, it's a placeholder. You can get rid of it later. The final result, your final book can look way different from what your initial draft looks like. But you need that initial draft to get to that final place. And what I just said, try out different tactics. So the don'ts here are to not aim for the final result, but aim for what you need to write right now, what your characters need right now, what your story needs right now. If you try to write with the final result in mind, that can become really crippling because you can start to feel like everything needs to be perfect, everything needs to sound like it needs to sound, but you've got plenty of time to fix all those things later. And tying into that is don't judge the quality of the story by the quality of the words that you're putting on paper right now. In my own writing, I tend to, on purpose, use words that don't make sense for the characters just to get through the story and to make sure that later on I'll take a good close look at that piece of dialogue and make sure that I use the right words. So in my fantasy story, okay is not an okay thing to say, but my characters in my initial draft say okay, all over the place. So it's okay to do that and to then come back to it. So train yourself to expect those later drafts. Instead of trying to get everything in that initial draft, train yourself to expect multiple drafts and not just 2 or 3, but multiple, like 10, 15.
But Elza, but Elza, I'm thinking about
Yes.
a woman who's like, but I'm busy and I want this book so bad, but I'm busy. Like I need every word. I need every hour that I spend on this to be the best hour I've ever spent on my work. Like she puts that pressure on herself.
Yeah.
What would you say to that writer who just feels like she can't waste her time? Like it needs to be perfect the first time because the next draft can't take forever. Like, do we just tell her like, sorry, honey, like you have to expect that this is going to take 10 to 15 drafts. Like that's the reality of the writing process. Or like, what would you say to her?
I think I always like the metaphor of the garden, where if you have a garden that's completely overgrown with weeds, if you look at this bit of the garden and you start taking out all the weeds and you start making this part perfect, and then you step away and then you start making it even more perfect, and then you move on to the next. By the time you move on to the next bit, the weeds start regrowing in the first bit. So if you want to be efficient and if you want to be fast, then you remove all the weeds. First, all the weeds. Don't start planting stuff. Remove all the weeds first. Then you plant everything. So you do layer by layer instead of doing everything per chapter or per scene or anything like that. And in the end, you'll be way faster than if you try to perfect that single little piece.
Oh, that's a good analogy, friend. That's so good. That makes so much sense that we want to make sure that we're spending time on the whole picture and not like getting this chapter perfect before we have permission to move to the next one. Like it's
exactly
okay to look like just play in the dirt at first, right? And see what you're working with. And oftentimes we forget that yes, we hope for like the golden nuggets. We hope for like that super amazing seed, that golden nugget that stays to the final draft. But for the most part, I guess what we're doing is just like laying down this placeholder, right? Where
Yeah.
we created this bed, this garden bed, to play with your analogy, and we're just we're we're playing around, and we forget that manure is also helpful in the
Yes.
in the growing process, like what you perceive as something that was not helpful, or maybe you spent really a long time writing this scene in your first draft and it's not going to work in subsequent drafts. Like I think we
Yeah.
have to see that as not a waste of time, but like
Exactly.
manure that we are fertilizing this story with. That was
Yeah.
super fun to play with. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. And something I'd like to add there is that another analogy, if you put ingredients together in a pot and you let it boil for 5 minutes, it's not a soup. You won't have to taste. There will be elements, and the vegetables will be yummy and everything, but it's not the soup that you're looking for. It needs time to develop that flavor, and you won't know until you've tasted it a few hours down the line what it's supposed to taste like. So you can look at that soup and the ingredients at the start, but you won't know what it takes to get to that soup at the end. You don't know which herbs, which spices it needs to get to just the right taste. And I feel like a lot of writers try to save time by trying to perfect that initial bit, but you are inevitably going to come across things that you'll need to change at the beginning when you work through your story. So it saves time to, again, do layer by layer instead of trying to go bit by bit.